The story of Sophronia Galt is not one found in vetted historical journals or church records meticulously preserved against the ravages of time. It is a story that exists in the periphery, in the spaces between documented events, a chilling footnote to the harsh realities of life in 1848. It speaks to a fear older than the cobblestones of the village itself, a fear of the unknown residing not in the shadowed woods or the lonely country roads, but behind the eyes of a child. It is a testament to the chilling truth that when a community's faith is tested by something it cannot comprehend, it is often the innocent who are left outside the church doors, abandoned to the encroaching darkness. If the echoes of forgotten histories are what you seek, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider joining our archival efforts by subscribing, ensuring these stories are never truly lost to silence. The year 1848 brought with it a winter that seemed to bite deeper than any in recent memory, a cold that seeped through the thickest wool and settled in the bones of the village like a permanent affliction. Snow fell in relentless sheets, muffling the world in a blanket of oppressive white, burying fences and narrowing the dirt roads into treacherous, winding paths. It was a season that forced people inward, into the cramped confines of their homes and the even more claustrophobic spaces of their own minds. In this insular, snowbound world, whispers traveled faster than a horse-drawn sleigh, carrying with them the weight of suspicion and the sharp sting of communal anxiety. And that winter, the whispers all carried the same name, Sophronia. Sophronia Galt was 12 years old, a child on the cusp of womanhood, yet the change that had come over her had nothing to do with the natural progression of age. It was centered, inexplicably and entirely, in her eyes. Before the fear took root, she had been a child like any other, perhaps a little quieter, a little more observant. She had a peculiar talent for finding lost things, a dropped coin in the dust, or a missing button from a coat, her gaze seeming to pick out the object from its surroundings with an unnatural clarity. It was a harmless, even helpful quirk that her mother, Elspeth, had once remarked upon with a thin smile. But as that harsh winter descended, the nature of her gaze shifted, or perhaps it was merely that the villagers, trapped in the close quarters of their shared existence, finally began to notice its unnerving quality. They were described as too dark, but that was a simplistic, inadequate word for the effect they had. They were the color of wet earth at midnight, a blackness that seemed to absorb the weak winter light rather than reflect it. But it was not the color alone that caused a man to still his hand mid-task. It was their steadiness. Sophronia's eyes did not dart or flicker with the restless energy of youth. They did not betray curiosity or shyness or any of the fleeting emotions that normally pass across a child's face. They simply rested upon a person or an object with a calm, unwavering intensity, a look that felt less like seeing and more like knowing. Grown men who had faced down blizzards and wrestled with stubborn livestock, found themselves unable to meet that gaze for more than a fleeting second. Alistair, the blacksmith, a man whose arms were thick as oak limbs and whose face was perpetually smudged with soot, recalled a morning when the child had come to his forge with her father. He had looked up from the anvil, his hammer held aloft, and his eyes had met hers across the fiery glow of the coals. He said later, his voice low and devoid of its usual bluster, that it felt as if the girl were looking straight through him, past the muscle and bone, into a place he himself did not know was there. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He had brought his hammer down with a clang, missing the glowing iron entirely, and had not looked up again until he heard the crunch of her boots leaving in the snow. The whispers began in places like the forge, in the hushed corners of the general store where men gathered around the pot-bellied stove, ostensibly to warm their hands, but truly to exchange the small currency of village gossip. They spoke of the Galt girl's stare. They said it was unnatural, that it felt ancient, as if the eyes of a long-dead ancestor were peering out from a child's face. They struggled to articulate the precise nature of the unease she caused, falling back on vague, unsettling descriptions. One man claimed her eyes held no light. Another swore he had seen a flicker in their depths that was not a reflection of any candle or lantern. The words, once spoken, took on a life of their own, weaving a tapestry of fear around the girl. The hum of gossip became the town's atmospheric anchor, a constant, low-level thrum of suspicion that colored every interaction, every shared glance. The sound of her name was enough to make a group fall silent, to make men shift their weight and stare into their mugs of weak, bitter coffee. The question hung unspoken in the frigid air, a chilling enigma that no one dared to voice too loudly. What was it about Sophronia's eyes that terrified even the strongest among them? They were the eyes of a child, and yet they held a stillness that felt like a final judgment, a silent pronouncement on the state of a man's soul. To be seen by her was to feel utterly and completely known, and in that knowing, to be found wanting. The fear that gripped the men was a quiet, almost grudging admission of a disturbed order, but the reaction of the village children was something far more visceral and immediate. Childhood has its own ecosystem, its own complex set of rules and rituals, and Sophronia had once been a part of it. There was a time, not so long ago, when she would join the other children in their games behind the church, her laughter mingling with theirs in the crisp autumn air. She had been uncommonly good at hide and seek, able to remain motionless behind a tree or a stone wall for so long that the others would nearly give up before she was found. Now, that same stillness had become a source of terror. The games would begin as they always had, with shouts and chaotic energy, but the moment Sophronia turned her unwavering gaze upon the proceedings, a chill would descend. The laughter would falter, the running would slow, and one by one, the children would find excuses to leave. It was as if a cold wind, perceptible only to them, had swept through their circle, extinguishing the simple joy of their play. They did not understand what they were feeling, but they knew it was something to be fled from. They said she looked at them as if they were not really there, as if they were made of glass. Mothers, watching from their windows or from the steps of their homes, saw the change and acted upon a primal, protective instinct. Where once they might have offered Sophronia a piece of gingerbread or a kind word, they now gathered their own children closer when she passed. A hand would descend upon a small shoulder, a gentle but firm pressure guiding the child away, indoors, anywhere but in the path of that quiet girl with the unnerving eyes. Elspeth Galt saw it all. She saw the way her neighbors' wives would suddenly become engrossed in shaking out a rug when she approached, their faces turned away. She saw the way children who once knocked on her door asking for Sophronia now ran past her house, their eyes averted. The isolation was a physical presence, a wall of cold shoulders and silent judgment being built around her family, brick by invisible brick. The whispers of the village were a constant, suffocating hum that she could feel, even within the supposed sanctuary of her own home. She would watch her daughter in the evenings, sitting by the fire, her hands busy with a piece of needlework. In the flickering firelight, Sophronia could almost look like any other 12-year-old girl. But then she would look up, her work forgotten in her lap, and her eyes would fix upon some indeterminate point in the middle distance, and the illusion would shatter. Elspeth would feel a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, a cold dread that was 1,000 times worse than the town's gossip, for it was a fear for her own child. Alistair, Sophronia's father, dealt with the growing crisis in the way he dealt with most problems, with a mixture of stubborn denial and simmering anger. He heard the whispers, and they fueled a deep resentment within him. He told Elspeth that it was just village ignorance, the foolish superstitions of small-minded people. He insisted there was nothing wrong with their daughter, that she was just a quiet, thoughtful child. But his denials grew weaker with each passing day, his bluster fading into a troubled silence. He could not deny the evidence of his own senses. He, too, had felt the disquieting power of his daughter's gaze. He had found himself avoiding her eyes, busying himself with chores whenever she entered a room, a profound sense of shame accompanying his fear. The silence in their home grew heavier, thick with unspoken anxieties. The comfortable rhythms of family life were replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. They moved around each other with a carefulness usually reserved for the gravely ill, afraid to say or do anything that might provoke what they did not know. They only knew that their daughter was drifting away from them, becoming a stranger in their own house. The breaking point came on a particularly bleak afternoon in late January. Elspeth had been kneading dough in the kitchen, the familiar, rhythmic work, a small comfort in the mounting tension. Sophronia was sitting in a chair by the window, not reading, not sewing, simply looking out at the snow-covered lane. A neighbor, Mistress Gable, walked past with her young son, a boy of about 6. The boy, catching sight of Sophronia in the window, stopped dead in his tracks and began to cry, a high, terrified wail that cut through the winter quiet. His mother quickly scooped him up, casting a single, fearful, accusatory glance toward the Galt's window before hurrying away. In that one look, Elspeth saw everything: the fear, the pity, the condemnation. It was the moment she knew they could not go on as they were. The village had already passed its judgment. That night, after Sophronia was in her bed, Elspeth and Alistair sat at their small wooden table, the candle between them casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the creak of the old house settling. It was Elspeth who finally broke the silence. She told her husband, her voice barely more than a whisper, that they had to do something. She spoke of the fear in the eyes of the other mothers, of the isolation that was strangling their family. Alistair sat with his head in his hands, his usual anger gone, replaced by a look of profound, weary despair. He had no answers. He had worked his entire life to provide for his family, to protect them, and now he was faced with a threat he could not fight with his hands or his will. It was an enemy that resided within his own home, behind his own daughter's eyes. As their desperation deepened, their thoughts turned, as they so often do in times of inexplicable crisis, toward the church. It stood at the center of the village, its tall, white spire a beacon of order and certainty in a harsh and unpredictable world. It was the house of God, a place of sanctuary and salvation. If there was an answer to be found, if there was a remedy for the strange affliction that had taken hold of their daughter, surely it would be found there. The church was their last hope, the only institution powerful enough to confront the darkness that the villagers whispered about. Their decision was made not with a sense of triumphant faith, but with the quiet desperation of two people who had exhausted all other options. They would bring Sophronia to the church. They would place her before God and the community, and pray that the cleansing light of faith could restore to her the simple, untroubled gaze of a child, and in doing so, restore their family to the world that had cast them out. They clung to this hope as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood, unaware that they were about to set their daughter on a path that would lead not to salvation, but to a confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace of the village forever. The decision to return to the church was a fragile thing, a desperate prayer whispered into the heart of a long and unforgiving winter. The Sunday arrived cloaked in a gray, unyielding light, the sky the color of old pewter. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, each breath a small, painful act of will. In the Galt home, a tense and deliberate silence reigned. Elspeth moved about the small kitchen with a rigid formality, preparing a meager breakfast that no one truly wanted. She laid out their Sunday clothes, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of wood smoke and camphor. They were clothes of respect, of supplication, and she smoothed the wrinkles from Sophronia's dark wool dress with hands that trembled slightly. Alistair, for his part, stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the snow-choked lane, as if he could divine their fate in the frozen patterns on the glass. He was a man being marched toward a cliff's edge, his stubborn pride having finally crumbled under the weight of a fear he could not name. Between them, Sophronia sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, a picture of perfect, unnerving stillness. She ate the oat porridge her mother placed before her without comment, her movements economical and precise. She did not seem to share her parents' anxiety. She did not, in fact, seem to feel anything at all. Her composure was a placid lake beneath which her parents could only imagine unthinkable depths. The church bell began to toll, its heavy, bronze voice rolling across the frozen village, a summons to the faithful. The sound was meant to be a comfort, a weekly affirmation of order and divine grace. But to Elspeth and Alistair, it sounded like a judgment. Each peal seemed to mark the seconds leading to their trial. They dressed in their somber attire, the act of buttoning coats and tying scarves feeling like the donning of armor for a battle they were certain to lose. Alistair took his daughter's hand, his grip tighter than necessary. Elspeth pulled her shawl close, a thin barrier against the cold and the stares she knew were waiting for them. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them with a physical force. The walk to the church was a short one, but it felt like a journey of miles. They walked past houses where curtains twitched in the windows. They saw neighbors hurry ahead, their backs turned, their pace quickening to avoid an encounter. The village was a living organism, and it was collectively holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the Galt girl crossed the threshold of the one place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for all. The church itself was a stark, unadorned structure of white clapboard and plain glass windows, its steeple a sharp finger pointing at the indifferent gray sky. It was a house built on practicality and a stern, unwavering faith, a faith that was about to be tested in a way its builders had never conceived. As they mounted the wooden steps and Alistair pushed open the heavy oak door, a wave of warm, candle-scented air washed over them, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. But the warmth was purely physical. The social atmosphere within the narthex was colder than the winter wind. The low hum of conversation, the quiet greetings and rustle of heavy coats, ceased the instant they were seen. It was as if a switch had been thrown, plunging the small space into an abrupt and profound silence. Every eye turned toward them, and then, just as quickly, every eye turned away. People shuffled aside, creating a wide, unnatural path for the family of three. No one spoke a word of welcome. No one offered a nod of greeting. It was a shunning, swift and absolute. Elspeth kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her face burning with a shame she had done nothing to earn. Alistair's jaw was set like granite, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he propelled his small family forward, down the central aisle. The interior of the church was cavernous and dim, the light from the tall, clear windows doing little to dispel the shadows that clung to the high, raftered ceiling. The air smelled of old wood, melting wax, and the faint, damp scent of wet wool. Their footsteps echoed on the worn floorboards, each step a loud announcement of their intrusion. They took their usual place in a pew about a third of the way back from the pulpit. The wood was cold and unyielding beneath them. Around them, the congregation resettled, the rustling of clothes and the clearing of throats sounding unnaturally loud in the echoing stillness. But the quiet that followed was different from the usual reverent hush of a Sunday service. It was a silence stretched taut with tension, a collective unease that was as palpable as the cold stone foundation of the building. People sat stiffly in their pews, their bodies angled slightly away from the Galts. Hymn books were clutched in white-knuckled hands. Glances were stolen, quick and fearful, like birds darting away from a predator. They were not looking at the family, not really. They were looking at the child who sat between her parents, her back ramrod straight, her dark head unbowed. Sophronia did not look around. She did not fidget or seem to notice the oppressive weight of the room's attention. Her gaze was fixed on the simple wooden cross that hung on the wall behind the pulpit, her focus as absolute and unwavering as it was on everything else she observed. Her stillness was a rebuke to the fidgeting anxiety around her, a calm center to the storm of communal fear. The pastor entered from a side door, a tall, gaunt man named Theron, whose face seemed permanently etched with the solemnity of his office. He was a man of firm beliefs and unwavering routine, a shepherd whose flock had, until recently, been predictable and easily managed. But in the preceding weeks, he had felt a strange current of fear and superstition running through his congregation, a current that had its source in the Galt family. He had heard the whispers, the increasingly wild tales about the girl's eyes. He had dismissed them at first as the idle gossip of a bored and isolated community, but the fear was real. He could feel it now as he ascended the steps to the pulpit. The air was thick with it, a spiritual malaise that his sermons on faith and charity seemed powerless to dispel. He opened his Bible, the heavy book falling open to a well-worn page, but his eyes were drawn, against his will, to the third pew. He saw the girl, a small dark shape between her anxious parents, and for a moment he felt a flicker of something that was not pity, but a cold, primal apprehension. Her stillness was profound. It was not the disciplined stillness of a well-behaved child, but the absolute, unbreathing stillness of something ancient and patient. He began the service, his voice, usually a resonant and commanding baritone, sounding thinner than usual in the vast, cold space. He led them in a hymn, but the response was weak, the voices of his flock hesitant and distracted. They were singing of salvation, but their eyes were darting toward the child who had become the embodiment of their damnation. During the long pastoral prayer, a time for quiet introspection and communion with the divine, the silence was broken by the sharp sound of a dropped hymn book. The clatter echoed through the church like a gunshot, and a dozen heads jerked up, eyes wide with alarm. The feeling was inescapable. They were all trapped in this cold, sacred space with something they did not understand, something their faith had not prepared them for. The pastor's sermon was on the parable of the lost sheep, on the duty of the shepherd to leave the 99 to save the one that has gone astray. The words felt hollow in his own mouth. He spoke of redemption and return, but he knew that his congregation was not thinking of a lost sheep. They were thinking of a wolf that had somehow wandered into the fold, a creature whose very presence threatened the safety of the entire flock. And as he spoke, he could feel Sophronia's eyes upon him. He did not look at her directly, but he felt her gaze as a physical pressure, a cool, steady weight against his soul. It was a gaze that seemed to strip the authority from his words, to question the very foundations of the faith he was proclaiming. When the service finally, mercifully, concluded, the congregation did not linger to exchange pleasantries as they usually did. There was a palpable urgency to their departure, a quiet, orderly rush for the doors, for the clean, cold air outside. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the Galt family. Pastor Theron knew he could not delay. He had a duty to his flock, to the preservation of the sanctity of his church. He intercepted Alistair and Elspeth as they were about to step into the aisle. He asked them, his voice low and firm, if he could have a word with them. He led them to a small, drafty alcove near the entrance, away from the last of the departing parishioners. Sophronia followed, her small hand still held in her father's. The pastor was a man accustomed to being in control, to offering counsel and spiritual guidance. But as he faced the family, he felt a profound sense of inadequacy. Elspeth looked at him with pleading, desperate eyes, her face pale and drawn. Alistair's expression was a mask of belligerent despair, the look of a man cornered and ready to lash out. The pastor addressed them with a pained, formal tone. He said that he understood their desire for comfort and community. He told them that the house of God was open to all who truly sought solace. But he also spoke of the disruption. He mentioned the whispers, the fear that had taken root among the faithful. He said, with a finality that crushed Elspeth's last, desperate hope, that for the good of the congregation, for the restoration of peace and proper worship, they should not bring their daughter to the church again. Alistair started to speak, a protest forming on his lips, but the pastor raised a hand, his expression unyielding. It was not a debate, it was a decree. Throughout this quiet, devastating exchange, Sophronia had not moved. She had simply watched the pastor, her head tilted slightly to one side. As her father's hope died and her mother's heart broke, her expression remained one of serene, untroubled calm. There was no outburst. There were no tears, no childish tantrum, no sign that she even understood the magnitude of their rejection. She simply stood there, a silent observer to her own excommunication. And it was this, more than anything, that sealed the pastor's resolve and chilled him to the bone. A child should have cried. A child should have been frightened or angry. Her quiet, placid compliance was more unsettling than any defiance could possibly have been. It felt like an acknowledgement, a silent agreement with his verdict, as if she knew all along that this was not a place where she belonged. He looked into her eyes for a single fleeting second, and felt as if he were looking into a deep, still well, and something was looking back out. He stepped away, offering a curt, final nod, and turned his back on them, a shepherd abandoning one of his flock to the wolves he could feel circling in the dark. The walk home was a funereal procession. The rejection from the house of God was a far heavier burden than the whispers of the village. It was a formal declaration that they were alone, that their trouble was beyond the reach of faith, beyond the power of the community's spiritual anchor. The church had not shielded itself from the child. It had cast her out, and in doing so, had left her on a threshold, not of its own hallowed halls, but of a much older, a much darker sanctuary that was now free to claim her as its own. The church's rejection was not a clean wound. It was a festering one that poisoned the very air within the Galt household. The formal decree from Pastor Theron had severed their last tie to the community, leaving them adrift in a sea of silent condemnation. In the days that followed, a new and more profound phase of their isolation began. The villagers no longer needed to whisper. Their judgment was now sanctioned by the highest authority they knew. The Galt house became a place to be hurried past, a structure that seemed to cast a longer, darker shadow than any other in the village. But the true horror was not what was happening outside their walls, but the transformation taking place within. The exclusion from the fold of faith did not diminish Sophronia. It seemed, instead, to nourish the strange power that resided within her. It was as if, having been denied a place in the house of God, she was now free to fully inhabit a different, more ancient dominion. The change was most apparent in her gaze. Where before it had been unsettling, It was now an active, potent force. It no longer felt merely knowing, it felt possessive. It seemed to lay claim to whatever it fell upon, drawing the life and warmth out of it, leaving behind a residue of cold unease. The children of the village were the first to feel the full, terrifying weight of this change. Their avoidance of her was no longer a matter of instinctual discomfort. It was a desperate, panicked flight. They spoke of a coldness that emanated from her, a tangible chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Young Thomas, the cooper's son, was chasing a wooden hoop down the lane when it rolled to a stop just a few feet from where Sophronia stood watching from her yard. The boy, forgetting himself for a moment in his play, ran to retrieve it. As he bent down, he looked up, and his eyes met hers. He froze, his hand hovering over the hoop. Later, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as he sat wrapped in a blanket by his own hearth, he told his mother that it felt as though icy fingers had gripped his heart. He said he could not move, could not breathe, could not even cry out. He was simply pinned in place by the sheer force of her silent, unwavering attention. It was Sophronia who broke the contact, turning her head slowly to look at a passing crow. The moment her eyes left him, the boy gasped as if surfacing from icy water, scrambled to his feet, and fled, leaving his toy forgotten in the snow. The story spread through the village like a fever, passed between mothers in hushed, terrified tones. Sophronia's gaze was no longer just a passive, unnerving quality. It was an invisible weapon, a force that could paralyze and terrorize. The children's fear became absolute. They would not play in the lane near her house. If they saw her in the distance, they would turn and run, not with the jeers and taunts of childhood cruelty, but with the stark, primal terror of a fawn fleeing a wolf. While the world outside shrank away from her, Sophronia's world within the walls of her home was expanding in terrifying and inscrutable ways. The nights became the true theater of her transformation. Sleep, for her parents, had become a shallow, restless state, punctuated by the groaning of the house in the wind and the much more frightening sound of the silence from their daughter's room. Elspeth would lie awake for hours, her body rigid with anxiety, listening. She was listening for any sound, any sign of normal childhood restlessness, but none ever came. The silence from Sophronia's room was as profound and unnerving as her stare. It was a watchful, waiting silence, and it was in those hours, in the deepest part of the night, that Sophronia would keep her vigil. On one occasion, a floorboard creaked under the strain of the cold, and Elspeth, startled from a light doze, slipped out of bed. The moonlight, filtered through the frost on the window pane, cast a pale, spectral glow on the narrow hallway. She crept to her daughter's door, which stood ajar by a mere inch, and peered through the crack. The room was illuminated by a single, flickering candle on the nightstand, its small flame casting huge, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls. Sophronia was not in her bed. She was sitting upright in a small wooden chair, facing away from the door, toward the darkest corner of the room. Her posture was not one of sleepiness or idle contemplation. She was rigid, alert, her back a straight, unyielding line. She was utterly motionless, a small, still silhouette against the dancing candlelight. Elspeth's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter was not just sitting, she was attending. She was focused on the corner with an intensity that made the hair on Elspeth's arms stand on end. The corner itself was unremarkable, a simple meeting of two plastered walls, yet in that moment, it seemed to be a place of immense significance, a focal point of unseen energies. The shadows cast by the candle seemed to shy away from it, leaving it in a pool of darkness so complete it felt as if a piece of the night sky had been folded into the room. As Elspeth watched, her heart pounding against her ribs, Sophronia's head tilted slightly, the same minute gesture the pastor had seen, the gesture of someone listening intently to a whispered conversation. A profound, unnatural cold seeped from under the door, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter night. It was a dead, still cold, the cold of a place where life had never been. Elspeth backed away from the door, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She stumbled back to her bed and slid under the covers, but she did not feel safe. She felt as if the cold from that room had followed her, had seeped into her very bones. She lay there, shivering, until the first gray light of dawn, knowing with a certainty that defied all reason that her daughter had not been alone in that room. The church had turned them away, and now something else was watching with Sophronia in the night. Alistair, too, was a man besieged. His anger had long since burned out, leaving behind only the cold ashes of fear and impotence. He was a man of practical skills, a man who understood the world in terms of wood and iron, seed and harvest. This was a problem he could not fix, a threat he could not fight. His daughter was becoming something he did not recognize, and his powerlessness in the face of it was eroding his very sense of self. He began to find reasons to spend more time in the barn, mending tack that did not need mending, staring for long stretches at the snow-covered fields, his mind a turmoil of confusion and despair. But he could not escape the reality of what was happening. He would see it in the brief, fraught moments they shared as a family. At the dinner table, Sophronia would push her food around her plate, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame, and in their dark depths, Alistair would see the flame reflected, not as a single point of light, but as two, as if her eyes were a window onto another fire, a much larger and more terrible conflagration. The house, once a sanctuary of warmth and familiarity, now felt alien and menacing. The creak of the floorboards, the sighing of the wind in the chimney, every sound seemed to be a part of some secret language that only his daughter understood. The parents' desperation grew into a frantic, clawing thing. They were trapped, not just by the winter and the village's ostracism, but by their own love for their child. They could not abandon her. The thought, though it may have flickered in the darkest corners of their minds, was too monstrous to contemplate. But they could not live like this. The hope they had placed in the church, though it had been dashed, was the only hope they had ever had. And so, like gamblers who have lost everything but continue to bet on a single, impossible outcome, they decided they had to try again. Their conversations were hushed, furtive exchanges in the dead of night, after they were certain Sophronia was in her room, engaged in her silent communion. Elspeth argued that the pastor had not seen the worst of it. She said that if he could only see what she had become, he would understand that this was not a matter of social disruption, but of a soul in mortal peril. She believed, with a faith born of pure desperation, that the church's power was their only defense against the unseen thing that was claiming their daughter. Alistair, his practicality now completely subsumed by fear, agreed. He said they had not been forceful enough. He argued that they had allowed themselves to be turned away too easily. He spoke of forcing a confrontation, of bringing Sophronia before the entire congregation, not as a quiet parishioner, but as a subject for exorcism, for salvation. It was a wild, desperate plan, born of sleepless nights and unrelenting terror. They would not ask for permission this time. They would go during the largest service of the winter, when the church was full, and they would present their daughter to God and man, and demand that the forces of heaven be brought to bear on the darkness that had taken root in their home. It was a final, desperate plea for a miracle, a last stand against the encroaching shadow that threatened to consume them all. The day chosen for this desperate gambit was a Sunday in the heart of February, a day of such profound cold that the very air seemed brittle enough to shatter. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, thick and immaculate, muffling the world in a deceptive purity. For the Galts, there was no pretense of joining a community of worship. This was an invasion, a frontal assault on the institution that had cast them out. They did not walk with the downcast eyes of the supplicant, but with the grim, determined stride of soldiers marching into a battle they could not afford to lose. Alistair led the way, his hand not holding Sophronia's but gripping her upper arm, a gesture that was less about guidance and more about possession, ensuring she could not falter or retreat. Elspeth followed a step behind, her face a pale, taut mask of resolve, her eyes fixed on the church spire as if it were the shore of a distant, hoped-for land. Sophronia, bundled in her dark woolens, was the calm eye of her parents' personal storm. She moved with a liquid grace that seemed at odds with the frozen landscape, her gaze sweeping across the snow-laden trees and frosted windows with a serene, proprietary air, as if she were surveying her own vast and silent kingdom. Their arrival at the church was not a quiet intrusion. It was a galvanic shock to the system of the congregation. The service was already underway, the doors having been closed against the cold. Pastor Theron was in the midst of his sermon, his voice rising and falling in the familiar, comforting cadence of Scripture. The sound of the heavy oak doors groaning open was a violation, a sudden, jarring note of discord in the sacred melody of the Sabbath. Every head in the church turned, a collective, rustling motion like dry leaves stirred by a sudden wind. The sight of Alistair Galt, standing in the doorway, his daughter held firmly at his side, his face a thunderous mask of defiance, brought a dead, absolute silence to the room. The pastor's words died on his lips, his hand frozen in a gesture of pious exhortation. The air, which moments before had been thick with the comfortable warmth of shared faith, suddenly became thin and cold, charged with a voltage of pure, unadulterated fear. This was not a family seeking solace. This was a man bringing a curse back to the place he believed had birthed it through neglect. Alistair did not hesitate. He began to walk down the central aisle, his boots making a slow, rhythmic, damning sound on the wooden floorboards. The people in the pews recoiled from them as they passed. They did not merely shift away, they physically shrank, pressing themselves against the far sides of their benches as if to avoid contamination by some unseen plague. The space that opened around the family was a visible, tangible representation of their ostracism. They were a moving island of dread in a sea of terror. Elspeth followed, her courage faltering with every step, the hundreds of hostile, fearful eyes feeling like physical blows. But Alistair's focus was singular. He marched his daughter to the very foot of the chancel steps, directly below the pulpit, and there, in the most sacred space of the church, he stopped. He released Sophronia's arm and gave her a gentle, almost imperceptible push forward, placing her alone before the altar, a small, dark sacrifice offered up to a faith that had already rejected her. He then turned and stood, his legs planted wide, his arms crossed, a silent, defiant guard. For a long moment, the tableau held. The congregation was a wax museum of frozen horror. Pastor Theron, high in his pulpit, looked down at the child, and all the carefully constructed walls of his theology, all the comforting certainties of his faith, seemed to crumble into dust. The girl was no longer just a source of village gossip or a cause of quiet disruption. Her presence in this manner, in this sacred space, was a direct, blasphemous challenge. He could feel the collective will of his flock pressing in on him, a silent, desperate plea for him to do something, to reassert the order she had so thoroughly shattered, to prove that the power of God was greater than the unnerving stillness of one small child. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. He knew this was a moment that would define his ministry, his faith, and the very soul of the village itself. He had to act. He had to confront the darkness that Alistair Galt had thrown at his feet. Descending from the pulpit, he felt as though he were wading through water. The air was so thick with tension. He approached Sophronia with slow, deliberate steps, his black robes whispering against the floor. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to get too close. He raised his hands, not in a gesture of welcome, but as a ward against an unseen evil. His voice, when it came, was strained, a thin, reedy instrument playing a tune of desperate hope. He did not speak to the congregation or to the parents. He spoke to a power he could only hope was listening. He implored the Almighty to look down upon this child, a lamb who had wandered into a shadowed valley. He begged for divine aid, for a sign of grace that would calm the troubled hearts of his flock. His prayer grew in volume and intensity, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic, feverish torrent. He spoke of the sanctifying power of the Church, of the blood of the Savior that could wash away all taint and all affliction. The congregation, emboldened slightly by his words, began to murmur their own prayers, a low, desperate hum that filled the cold air. The sound was not one of faith, but of fear seeking a place to hide. The pastor then turned his full attention to Sophronia, his voice taking on the sharp, authoritative edge of command. He looked not at her, but just past her, as if addressing something that stood behind her, invisible to all. He commanded her eyes to be normal again. He commanded any unclean presence that had attached itself to her to depart, to flee from this consecrated ground. He commanded the spirit of fear and confusion to be replaced by a spirit of peace and childlike innocence. He was fighting with the only weapons he possessed: words, faith, and the authority of his office. He was shouting into a void, hoping for an echo. Throughout this entire dramatic, desperate appeal, Sophronia had remained utterly still. She had not flinched at the pastor's raised voice. She had not bowed her head during the prayer. She had simply watched him, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes absorbing his frantic energy without reflecting any of it. When his final command had been uttered, when his words hung echoing in the strained silence of the church, she did something that no one could have anticipated. She smiled. It was not a smile of joy or mirth, not the smile of a child who had been freed from a burden. It was a slow, deliberate curving of her lips, a smile of ancient, terrible understanding. It was a smile that held no warmth, no humanity, only a chilling and profound amusement, as if she were a queen observing the frantic, meaningless antics of a court jester. And then, she lifted her gaze from the pastor and swept it across the congregation. Her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, from one pew to the next, from one terrified face to another. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The low hum of prayer died in a collective gasp. Her gaze was not a passive act of seeing, it was an act of transmission. It was a physical force, a tangible wave of cold that washed over the pews, extinguishing the last flickering embers of their courage. People felt it as a pressure behind their own eyes, a sudden, inexplicable dread that coiled in the pit of their stomachs. It was a gaze that did not just see them, it unmade them, stripping away their piety and their pretense, leaving only the raw, twitching nerve of their deepest fears. A woman in the back screamed, a single piercing shriek that shattered the last vestiges of decorum. The cry was a spark in a tinderbox. The collective fear, held in check for so long by the fragile container of the church service, found its release in a single, unified impulse: flight. The spell was broken. A chair scraped loudly as someone scrambled to their feet. A man cried out, his voice thick with panic. A wave of movement began in the back pews and surged forward, a human tide of terror. The The solemn order of the congregation dissolved into a frantic, chaotic maelstrom. People climbed over benches, their faces contorted with a mindless panic. They pushed and shoved, their Sunday finery tearing, their hymnals and Bibles forgotten on the floor. The only thought was to escape, to get out of that building, away from that child and her terrible burning eyes. The narrow aisles became bottlenecks of desperation. The sound was a cacophony of terror, the splintering of wood, the heavy, panicked breathing of the crowd, a chorus of terrified shouts, and the high, thin wail of a frightened child. They burst through the heavy oak doors and fled into the snow, not with relief, but with the frantic energy of a herd stampeding from a predator. They did not stop to help those who stumbled. They did not look back. They simply ran, fleeing the house of God as if it were the very mouth of hell. In less than a minute, it was over. The church, which had been packed to capacity moments before, was now a cavern of echoing silence. It was a scene of desecration. Overturned benches, dropped shawls, and scattered pages of scripture littered the floor. The icy air of the winter morning poured in through the open doors, a cold that now felt clean and preferable to the suffocating terror that had filled the room. Only a few figures remained. Alistair and Elspeth stood near the chancel, their desperate plan having succeeded in a way they could never have imagined, their victory a taste of ash in their mouths. And in the center of it all, before the altar, stood Sophronia, her smile gone, her expression once again one of placid, untroubled calm. The pastor remained at the foot of the chancel steps, his body trembling, his face the color of ash. He stared at the child, his faith in ruins around him. He had brought forth the full power of his office, and it had been met with a smile. He had commanded, and he had been ignored. The church had not saved the girl. The church, in the end, could not even save itself from her. The mass hysteria that had emptied his sanctuary was his final, terrible answer. His authority was gone, his words were powerless, and the child before him was utterly and completely beyond his reach, beyond the reach of God, a creature now and forever unsalvageable. The exodus from the church was not merely a flight of panic, it was a permanent severing. The villagers who fled into the snow that morning did not return to their homes, and later speak of the event with hushed reassessment. They carried the terror with them, embedding it deep into the foundations of their lives. The church doors had been flung open, and something had been irrevocably broken in the process. The sanctity of the space was shattered, and the Galt family was no longer just a source of uneasy gossip. They were the epicenter of a communal trauma, a walking, breathing testament to a faith that had failed. In the immediate aftermath, a small, somber delegation from the church elders, led by a visibly shaken Pastor Theron, made a final, formal visit to the Galt home. They did not cross the threshold. They stood on the packed snow of the front path, their hats clutched in their hands despite the biting wind, their faces grim and set. Their purpose was not to offer comfort or to seek understanding. It was to deliver a final, unappealable verdict. Alistair met them at the door, his own face a landscape of hollowed-out despair. The fire of his defiance had been extinguished by the catastrophic outcome of his own desperate act. Pastor Theron, his voice devoid of its usual pastoral warmth, spoke in clipped, formal tones. He told Alistair what he already knew, what the entire village now knew. He spoke of a presence that was incompatible with a congregation of the faithful. He used words like unclean and beyond reach, theological terms that did little to mask the raw, primal fear that underpinned them. He declared, with the exhausted authority of a defeated general, that Sophronia was unsalvageable. It was a pronouncement of spiritual damnation, an official and eternal excommunication not just for the child, but for the entire family. The church, he explained, could offer them nothing more. Their struggle was now a private one, a burden to be borne in isolation. There would be no more prayers, no more counsel. They were being surgically removed from the body of the community, a diseased limb severed to prevent the spread of a contagion of fear. The elders nodded in grim agreement, their eyes avoiding the dark windows of the house behind Alistair. The pronouncement was delivered, and without another word, they turned and walked away, their black coats stark against the endless white of the snow, leaving the family formally and completely alone, adrift in a silence more profound than any winter storm. The weight of this final abandonment settled upon the small house like a physical shroud. For Elspeth and Alistair, the world was now reduced to 3 rooms and the terrifying, inscrutable presence of their own daughter. The frantic hope that had propelled them to the church was gone, replaced by a suffocating, intimate horror. They were no longer trying to save Sophronia from the village. They were now trying to save themselves from her. Their love for her, the deep, instinctual bond of parent to child, was still there, but it was now hopelessly entangled with a visceral fear that poisoned every interaction, every shared silence. They could not cast her out into the snow. The act was too monstrous, a final line of inhumanity they were not yet willing to cross, and so they turned their home into a prison for her and for themselves. They kept her locked in her room. It was not a decision made in a single, dramatic moment, but one that evolved from a series of smaller, fearful retreats. It began with closing her door at night, then wedging a chair beneath the knob. Soon, the door was kept shut during the day as well. Meals left on a small tray on the floor outside, retrieved later, often untouched. The act of turning the key in the lock for the first time was a moment of profound, soul-crushing failure for Alistair. Each metallic click was an admission of his utter defeat, a sound that echoed the closing of the church doors, the shutting of the community's hearts, the final, tragic confinement of their lives. The house grew colder, quieter. The parents moved about like ghosts, their conversations reduced to essential, whispered phrases. They were living on a knife's edge of terror, attuned to every sound that came from behind the locked door, but there were rarely any sounds of protest. There was no rattling of the doorknob, no childish pleas for release. There was only the same profound, unnerving silence that had filled her corner of the church. This silence was, in its own way, more terrifying than any tantrum. It suggested an acceptance, a contentment with her solitude that was deeply unnatural. It was as if the room were not a prison to her at all, but a sanctuary, a private chapel where she could commune with her unseen parishioners without interruption. The only sounds they ever heard were the faint, rhythmic creak of the floorboards as she paced, and, as the days bled into one another, the soft, almost inaudible murmur of her voice. She was talking. The sound would begin late in the evening, after the last of the winter light had faded from the sky. It was a low, steady whisper, a sibilant, flowing sound that was impossible to decipher through the thick wood of the door. It was not the sound of a child talking to herself, not the sing-song cadence of imaginary play. It was the sound of a conversation. It had the rhythm of discourse, with pauses and inflections that suggested a dialogue with a listener who made no audible reply. Elspeth would stand in the hallway for hours, her ear pressed against the cold wood of the door, her body trembling. She would try to make out the words, desperate for any clue, any fragment of meaning that might explain what was happening to her daughter. But the whispers remained an inscrutable, terrifying murmur, a secret language spoken in the dark. She could only guess at the nature of the unseen presence that her daughter was conversing with. She imagined something ancient and patient, a being that had been drawn to the strange, quiet light of her daughter's soul, a companion that had been waiting for her in the corners of the night all along. The atmosphere of the house became thick and suffocating, each day a repetition of the one before, a slow, agonizing descent into a shared madness. The small details of their new reality were the most haunting. The smell of the candle wax that was constantly burning in Sophronia's room, a scent that now seemed funereal. The sight of her untouched food, a silent testament to her rejection of their world, of their nourishment. And, most terrifying of all, the brief, stolen glimpses they caught of her. On one occasion, Alistair, his hand shaking, unlocked the door to deliver her evening meal. He opened it just a crack, intending to slide the tray inside without looking, but he could not stop himself. He glanced into the room, and what he saw seared itself into his memory. The room was lit by a single, tall candle on the nightstand. Sophronia was sitting on the edge of her bed, her back to him, her head bowed as if in prayer or intense concentration. She was whispering, the soft, sibilant sounds filling the small space. As he watched, she slowly turned her head, as if she had sensed his presence at the door. Her face was illuminated from below by the candlelight, her features thrown into sharp, alien relief. And her eyes. They seemed to be the only true source of light in the room. They were not merely dark, they glimmered. They shone with a soft internal luminescence, like polished stones reflecting a fire that no one else could see. It was a cold, unholy light, the light of a dying star, or the phosphorescence of deep-sea creatures that live their entire lives in absolute blackness. The glimmer was hypnotic, terrible, and utterly inhuman. It was the light of a soul that had been completely transformed, remade in the image of the unseen thing to which she now whispered her devotions. Alistair slammed the door shut, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled with the key, locking it, and then leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. The image of those glimmering, fire-reflecting eyes burned forever onto the back of his own. The church had declared her unsalvageable. Her parents, in their terror, had made her a prisoner. But behind the locked door, in the flickering candlelight, it was becoming increasingly clear that Sophronia was not the one who was truly trapped. She was finally and completely free. The final turn of the season, from the iron grip of winter to the slow, reluctant thaw of spring, brought no relief to the Galt household. The melting snow revealed a landscape of mud and dormant, gray earth, a world that seemed to mirror the family's own exhausted and hopeless state. Within the walls of their self-imposed prison, the transformation that had begun in whispers and unsettling glances was now reaching its silent, terrifying apex. Sophronia's isolation was no longer a confinement, it was an incubation. The locked room had become a chrysalis from which something new and wholly alien was preparing to emerge. Her parents, now little more than jailers in their own home, had all but ceased to be her family. They were the keepers of a strange, holy relic, a thing they both feared and were bound to protect. Their interactions with her were reduced to the most basic, fearful rituals. The sliding of a tray of food through a cracked open door, the quick exchange of a spent candle for a new one, all done with averted eyes and hearts that beat a frantic, terrified rhythm. They were living in the orbit of a dying star, their own lives and warmth being slowly siphoned away to fuel its cold, implacable light. The glimpses they caught of her, rare and fleeting as they were, became fragments of a waking nightmare. One evening, Elspeth, steeling herself to retrieve the dinner tray, pushed the door open a few inches. The candle inside had burned low, its flames sputtering, casting long, frantic shadows. For a moment, she thought the room was empty. Then, she saw her. Sophronia was standing in the far corner, the same corner she had stared into on those long, watchful nights. She was not facing the corner this time, but had her back pressed against it, as if seeking to merge with the very walls of the house. She was looking directly at the door, at the sliver of light from the hallway. And her eyes. Elspeth had seen them glimmer before, but this was different. The faint, reflective light had intensified, coalescing into two steady, unwavering points of flame. It was not a reflection. The sputtering candlelight was too weak to create such an effect. This was a light that burned from within, an unholy effulgence that seemed to be fueled by the very darkness of the room. They were the eyes of a nocturnal predator, eyes that had fully adapted to a world without sun, a world of shadows and secrets. They held no recognition of Elspeth, no flicker of memory or emotion. They were simply ancient, patient, and utterly devoid of anything human. Elspeth let the door swing shut, a strangled sob caught in her throat. The girl she had raised, the child whose face she knew better than her own, was gone. In her place was this creature of shadow and cold fire, this silent sentinel of an unseen kingdom. The whispers from behind the door grew more frequent, the cadence more confident. Sophronia spoke more often to the unseen presence, her voice no longer a hesitant murmur, but a low, conversational tone, as if she were discussing matters of great importance with a respected and familiar companion. A new and terrifying phenomenon accompanied these conversations. The room grew colder when she spoke. It was a measurable, physical change in temperature. Alistair, driven by a morbid, scientific curiosity that was perhaps the last vestige of his rational mind, would hold his hand to the crack at the bottom of the door. When the room was silent, he would feel only the normal, drafty chill of the old house. But when his daughter began to speak, a current of profound, unnatural cold would seep out, a cold so intense it felt like a physical touch, a cold that spoke of deep space, of the grave, of places where the warmth of life had never reached. And then, when she fell silent, the cold would recede, the ordinary chill of the house returning, leaving behind a lingering sense of violation. It was as if her words were a bridge, a conduit through which the atmosphere of another world, a cold and lightless world, could bleed into their own. By now, the villagers' avoidance of the house was absolute. They did not just hurry past. They would cross to the other side of the road, sometimes making a wide, looping detour through the muddy fields to avoid coming within 100 feet of the Galt property. The house had become a landmark of fear, a place accursed. The story of the winter mass had grown into a full-blown legend, embellished with each telling, a cautionary tale whispered to frighten children and chasten the proud. The Galts, in their isolation, were slowly ceasing to be people at all. They were becoming part of the story, characters in a local piece of Gothic horror. No one knocked on their door. The baker no longer left bread on their step. They were utterly, completely cut off, left to marinate in the strange, cold horror that had consumed their home. But they were not entirely unobserved. Sophronia had taken to sitting at her window for long hours of the day. The window was small and grimy, but through it, she watched the life of the village from which she had been exiled. She would sit on a small stool, her body perfectly still, her head framed in the center of the pane, and the villagers, even from a distance, could feel her gaze upon them. A farmer driving his cart down the lane would feel a sudden chill on the back of his neck and would look up, against his will, to see the small, dark shape in the window, watching. A woman hanging laundry in her yard would feel a sudden, prickling sense of being observed and would turn to find those distant, unblinking eyes fixed upon her. Her gaze, even through the distorting glass of the old window, had lost none of its power. It followed them, a silent, constant reminder of the faith that had failed, of the child they had abandoned, of the darkness that now resided in their midst. She was no longer a part of their world, but she was its silent, eternal witness. She had been cast out by the church, locked away by her parents, and shunned by the world of men, but she had, in the end, triumphed. She had found her own congregation, her own communion. The final, lingering image of her story, the one that would haunt the village for generations, was of her face in that window as dusk fell. The last of the sun's light would fade, and the interior of the house would dissolve into impenetrable blackness. But for a few moments, just before the darkness became absolute, two faint, glowing points of light would remain visible in the window frame. They would hover there in the gloom, unblinking, unwavering, like the eyes of an owl waiting patiently for the true night to begin. They were the eyes that would not close, the eyes of a girl the church could not save because she had never truly been lost. She had been claimed, transformed, and granted a power that their hymns and prayers could never hope to touch. And in the dark, in the cold, haunted silence of the house, she sat at her window, waiting, her gaze a final, unresolved chord of terror that would echo in the village's memory long after the last candle in her room had finally burned itself out. The record on Sophronia Galt is complete, and your presence through its final page means more than you know. If you have just found our channel, subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive, so you are here when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments how this story spoke to you.